Okay, so now we have our level, which we can um, load any level we create. And inside of this level that we've created in the last tutorial, we have our player here who is just hopping around in the same spot. Our temporary player, of course. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start attaching an action to our player model. So in our script, we type action, and I usually like to use the player act as a template. Whoops. Name. I always use the player act for my players. So our player, first of all, right. So the first thing that we need to do is make a while loop. So while infinite, or while 1, we're going to wait 1 frame every time it cycles through. If you don't put a while, it's going to result in an engine crash. So while 1, we're going to run a function that we're going to create. So FPS camera. So while the player is running forever, it will run this function. Now we haven't created this function, we're going to do that now. Anytime you create a function that is being referenced underneath, for example, we're calling this inside of here. So if we were to put this function underneath, this function would not be usable because we haven't defined it. So therefore, by placing it up here, we're defining it, and it will now understand what we're referring to when it gets to that line of code. So here's our function that we're creating that will monitor our camera. Now, the purpose of a function is to hold information that can be used in multiple ways in this script, but instead of writing it out, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 lines right here, we can write them into a function and therefore only have to write the name of the function, where we want those lines of code to happen, and keep our action nice and tidy, ultimately allowing us to apply that same function in another place inside of this action without having to copy and paste it and have 200 lines of code dedicated to what could only need 102 lines of code. So now we have our camera. What we need to do, or now that we've created the function for our camera, we need to actually create our camera. So we're going to place the camera right onto our player's little point. Oops, okay. Player. So on this little point right here, that's where our camera is going to be. So to do that, inside of here, we go vec4 vertex. Okay? And as you can see there, so we need to define a vector. So what vector point is it going to be at? The entity, which is the player entity, and the var number. So we're going to place it at the player I position, and .x because it is a vector, which means a vector is xyz, or is a coordinate. And the entity, because it's player specific for the camera, we can say me, which it knows to refer to it as me, so it knows it's referring to itself. And the number is the number of the vertex where we're attaching the camera. So we're attaching it to vertex number 9. So by setting this to number 9, close it, end it, we now know that player I position is vertex number 9. Now we haven't defined player I position, so we need to do that up here. vector with an asterisk, and I believe that's all we need to have. Actually, we go var player pose, just like that. Alright, sorry, I was wrong once again. I double checked it, and it's actually like this, vector and the name of our vector. That's simple. Okay, so now we have our vector position. We've defined where it is. Now we can say that the camera.x equals player ipose.x. Oops. Copy, paste. So we could write it like this, but it would be a lot cleaner to write it like this. And so the way I like to look at this is that we're saying camera.x equals, but instead of equals you put a comma, and it's equal to player x. And it therefore knows to use all of three of these elements in each one of these because we're setting a vector. So it knows to use each three values of that vector. Okay, so then up here we say camera.x equals my.x, so that the camera is always facing where the player is looking, and camera, sorry, what am I thinking? It's pan. Sorry about that. Wasn't thinking correctly there for a second. So camera.pan is equal to my.pan, and camera dot tilt plus equals 5 times mouse force dot y times time step, and time step is making use of our FPS lock variable. And the reason why we're using time step is because we're making an increment in the game. So this affects the basically, like, if we were counting up a number by 1, we wouldn't use time step because that would multiply it by time step, and therefore you wouldn't want to go 1 plus time step equals 1 plus time step, because you wouldn't be always equaling to 2. You'd get a different number, and in fact I believe you'd get like a 0-point number if you did that. So anyway, only use time step in instances where you're not trying to keep a tally of a number. Okay, so there. Now if we run our script, oh, I'm sorry, one more step. We have to apply our action to our player. So make sure your player is selected and come over here to the behavior. You'll see it says action. Set the player action. Now if that's not appearing, that's because you have to go to preferences and set the reload of external modified files to auto. Hit apply or just press OK. Once you've done that, it will automatically load your files. Then you should be able to find player action here. Once you've done that, build and run. Okay, so because we've only set the tilt to follow the player's movement, it's only going to be the tilt that moves. So we've now set that up. In the next tutorial, we're going to start setting up a little bit more in-depth movement, and we're also going to fix that little bit of a glitch with the textures or skin in the model.